Hello my friends and welcome. This is a replica sword, an excellent replica of the sword used by medieval knights in 700 AD in the early old Denver area. It was known as the Knit Utilitas Maximus and renowned for its utility. You see, what history books won't tell you is that the knights of the olden day needed a sword that could function more as an instrument of war, but also as a utility blade in its downtime. Depicted here in the Waldo Tapestry of 88, you can see that knights did in fact have downtime. It needed to be able to butter bread, dice carrots, and skewer shrimp as well as men. It needed to be able to pick things up from the ground because bending over was heavy and hard in armor. It needed to work as a mushroom toaster and a chicken roaster. It needed to turn off the torch at the end of a long day. Surely the sword was required to have many utilities beyond just killing. After the Battle of Old Denver in 948 AD, the sword became more of a farming implement. It was used as a rancher's tool for animal husbandry purposes. The primary use, of course, was the insemination of buffalo. A poor choice in hindsight, as it drove the buffalo to the point of extinction. The history of the Knit Utilitas Maximus, now reproduced by Ronin Katana, and before you ask, yes, they also make katana, can be seen here in all of its glory.
Alright, enough of that. It's time for the marginally less silly part. We'll start with the pommel. The pommel is a faceted type that has a nice round base and a comfortable transition. Now, I don't particularly like that it's not lined up well with the grip. It could be a little bit better, but I do like how it feels in my hand. It's a very comfortable shape. It's very easy to grip, and that goes with the peen as well. The peen is pretty well formed. There's no transition or ledge or anything that catches on your hand or on a glove. It should also be noted that the crossguard and the pommel are not magnetic. So they're made out of some sort of alloy. It feels sturdy, it doesn't bend, it doesn't move under pressure, but it is some sort of not magnetic substance. Now we can talk a little bit about the grip. Now I'm guessing it's a wooden core. I'm basing that assessment on, or assumption rather, on the fact that other Ronin swords from this series have been wooden cores. It's a wooden core that's been epoxied onto the tang, then it's been wrapped in leather, then bound in cord. And I like the way the grip feels, frankly. I mean, comfort-wise, it's very nice. I like the size of it. I like the way it feels in my hands. It doesn't chew up my hands at all. It's easy to handle barehanded or in a glove. However, I'm not really sure about the reliability of the cord. The cord moved around a little bit before I started really using the sword at all. And in other examples of these swords that I've had, the cord comes undone with really heavy use, and that's something that I would say concerns me. I also don't really fully understand the placement of the secondary ring. You can see that it's a little bit on the low side. It's the right height if your hand sits on the pommel rather than on the grip, but I'm not entirely sure. It's just not where I would expect it to be. It doesn't necessarily look symmetrical, but it's functional. Now on the subject of the crossguard, it came to me with some pings and dings, and I know this sword was tested by somebody else before I got it, so I can't really hold any kind of scuffs or anything like that against it. I think it has a nice shape, and honestly on this subject I don't really have a whole lot to complain about. I would like to see maybe some more refined lines. They're soft and rolled, and it doesn't really dig into your hand or arm or anything if you're using the sword, but at the same time I'd like it to be a little bit crisper if that was anything to really complain about. Now also the tang hole, or the spot where the tang goes through the crossguard, it sounds like a dirty term, but it's not. It's reasonably well fit. I wouldn't necessarily call it friction fit or necessarily 100% perfect, but for the price point, it fits a lot better than some of the other stuff I've seen out there. And there's not necessarily an enormous gap or any major issue with it. Some of the epoxy is coming through some of the small holes in the gap between the tang and the blade and the crossguard, but overall I'd say it looks pretty good and it's reasonably well done. The scabbard is a wooden core scabbard. Now I've broken one of these in a previous video, and I can say that it's made out of wood, but it's on the thin side. That's not necessarily a bad thing though. New scabbards seem to be wrapped in leather, the new ones that the sword actually comes with. This is a prototype blade, and it comes with just a simple painted black scabbard. The other thing to note is that the components or the metal furniture on the scabbard add a really nice look. I think they add quite well to the utilitarian type feel of the blade. There's not a lot of frills going on with this sword, but I do like the additional adornments on the scabbard. The blade itself is smaller than I expected, and I don't mean that in a bad way. The Ronin single-handed arming sword and Viking sword that I tested in a previous video were a lot more substantial and stout blades than this one is. This one honestly is a little bit more refined, and I just didn't expect that. I don't know exactly what type of oakshot typology the blade is emulating either. It reminds me of some photos I've seen of Type 18Bs and Type 17s, but I don't know that system well enough to really give you a good idea of what it's trying to emulate. It's a long blade with a central ridge that runs through the blade, but the grip doesn't really fit in any of the descriptions that I mentioned for a Type 18B or a Type 17. Now that said, I don't think Ronin was trying to make anything specific. I don't think it's going after historic dimensions or a specific historic sword. I think they were trying to make something that functioned and looked cool at the same time. And in my mind, I think they've succeeded in that. The blade has a nice shape and it seems well done overall. There's not many wavy lines, or at least not as many as I would expect in a sub $300 sword. Now don't get me wrong, there is some unevenness in the planes and the blade is not perfect, but that's really what I would expect in a blade of this cost. Swords that cost 4 times as much have the same type of unevenness or wavy lines, so I'm not really bitching as much as I am noting. The blade had a really nice distal taper to it and no secondary bevels on the edge, at least not ones that I could see. It's not extremely sharp, but it's not really dull or anything like that either. The blade seemed very comfortable in terms of its point of balance and how point control worked, but I do have a few concerns over the center of percussion. It seemed to be at a little bit of a lower point, 22 inches from the guard, and that seemed a little bit lower. I would expect it to be more in the top third of the blade, but maybe I'm completely off on that. I don't know European swords well enough or European martial arts to say where exactly you're striking, but that did give me some concern. The blade also has a good amount of flex, but not so much flex that it's like a rapier or a really thin blade, but I would describe it as not extremely rigid. Handling wise, you can see that the blade cut water bottles pretty well, and that's really all I did in this video is cut some water bottles, and I would expect it to, but what I would note is that it actually cut water bottles versus ripping them in half. I've seen blades of lesser quality rip stuff in half, so I'm pretty happy with the results in terms of performance, thus far anyway. I also thought that the blade was pretty easy to maneuver, and point control wasn't difficult for a blade of its size. As I mentioned, I have some concerns about the center of percussion. I just don't know how that would impact historic European martial arts, but it certainly didn't impede my cutting water bottles, and I didn't feel any kind of rattling or wiggling in my hand. Value-wise, is it worth it? Yeah, in my mind. For $300 or less than $300, there's not necessarily an abundance of swords out there. There's a few competitive pieces, but a lot of times you're looking at maybe something from Windlass, Cold Steel, or Hanwei. And in terms of what this sword offers, I think the value is certainly there. You're not getting ripped off anyway. If you're looking for kind of a no-frills, simple, straightforward sword, I think this sword hits the mark.
Now is the part where I'm going to do a little bit of a comparison between the Ronin model, Euro model number 7, and a few other European swords that I happen to have around. Now, as you can probably see, I'm more of a Japanese sword guy, but I do happen to have a couple other manufacturers of European style swords. Before I get into it, none of them really have the same mission as this sword. So it's not necessarily a fair comparison because they're not in the same price point, they're not the same type of sword, but what I'm going to try and show you is some of the differences in finish quality that you can expect at a few various price points. At $250 to $300, whatever they're charging for them, this is a sword from Starfire, and the mission of this sword is wildly different, and I'll cover this sword maybe in a different video. What I do want to point out is just some of the finish quality a sword at a very similar price point will get you. So you can see that the pommel is fit on, it's not necessarily perfectly even. The grip is a kind of a leather type kind of hide substance, and it's on there pretty tight, but it seems like it could unwrap. I'm not necessarily super sold on this one either. The finish quality in terms of the blade, there's not really any gaps here, but the blade quality is a lot rougher. The grind on it is a lot more basic. This one doesn't have an edge, it's more made for probably stage type combat or show or something. But
the weight of the blade is also very different, and it doesn't feel anywhere near as comfortable in the hand, even though it's a bit shorter a sword. On any note, the finish quality on this seems a bit lackluster in comparison, and I understand that it has a different intention behind it, but it does show a contrast between finish quality of blades in similar price points. Now, this sword is a Deltin, and it would cost probably a little bit more than the Ronin sword. I got this secondhand, and the grip has been customized. So disregard that there's overlap here and that it might not necessarily fit well, or the kind of larger seam that you see here, and subsequently the rust on the blade as well, as the blade is secondhand. But there are some pieces that you can look at, and that is just the finish quality of the pommel itself. There's some pitting and some things that look like it was cast and not necessarily done super well. The peen on it is also, there's a pretty big kind of transition here, or a ledge that my finger will catch on. Has some pretty sizable spaces in it as well. And from what I understand, it's not uncharacteristic of things I've seen from Deltin, but I've also had Deltin swords that were a little bit more refined in terms of their finish quality than this as well. But this sword would be on a higher price point than the Ronin sword, and the finish quality, I see a very pronounced second bevel, and I don't see that on the Ronin sword. And the finish is of a similar grade in terms of the sand grit that they use. I don't know if it'd be 800 or 600 grit or what it is. This one looks like it's been resharpened, but the main point I'd point out is that the fittings don't, they're not wiggly or loose, but in terms of where they line up here and some of the casting and how it lines up, it's not necessarily significantly better than what I see on the Ronin sword. The last bit that I'll compare it to would be this Albion, and this is a sword in a much higher price category. This is probably close to $900 new. Again, this one is secondhand, and I've used it. But there are some things you can see in terms of where the crossguard lines up. There aren't any spaces. The finish quality, the blade has a lot less kind of ripples in it. The lines are all smooth. You can almost see the reflection in the camera. It's not perfectly smooth, but it's a little bit more refined than the Ronin sword is by contrast. The Ronin has a slightly shinier polish, but it isn't really noticeable. Finish quality wise, though, they have very similar pommel styles. The Albion has just a more refined quality. There's no lumps or bumps around it, and also the ledges are very crisp and clean without being sharp, so I don't cut my hand on them. The peen is kind of, I can't even really see it anymore, so it's not that it's just that it's sanded down, but that I can't really make it out. And in terms of feeling, this blade feels really, really great, and the center of percussion is close to where it should be, or at least where I would think it should be. I can't say where it should be. I'm certainly no authority on the matter. What I can say about the Ronin sword, though, if I'm giving any final thoughts, I haven't done destructive testing on it, but if this sword holds up in similar ways to the other Ronin swords that I've had, then from the European line or the Japanese line, then I'd be very satisfied with it for the money. Otherwise, the blade geometry, there's no really pronounced second bevel. I thought that was pretty nice. And just that it's smaller, thinner, and not necessarily such a huge honking blade in comparison to the other two Ronin swords that I was able to test, the Viking sword and the single-handed sword. This feels like a much more refined blade in terms of a user. But from what I see here, and from what I was able to find out from testing, I thought it was a really fun blade. I had a lot of fun with it. It's a joy to cut with, and I'm kind of sorry I'm going to break it later when it's warm. As you can see, I had fun playing in the snow with it, but doing destructive tests in the snow is not. It's already dangerous enough. I don't need to add slippery snow to it, or to try and hunt down the other half of a blade in a foot of snow in my backyard. So that's all I have for you. I hope the video was interesting and that you found the comparison at least mildly helpful. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned. I will have a destructive test probably in the next several months to continue breaking this blade. Thanks for watching. Cheers.
first I took the sword, and then I hit the stove, and then it didn't go, so then I hit the stove some more, and then I kind of thought I broke it, so I put the stove back a little bit, and I was like, well, wait a minute, maybe I can hold it together like this, like a sandwich. And then I was like, I want some bread. Gingerbread, hell yeah, that's why I broke that house right there, you know what I mean, yeah.